So I am thankful for each of the four seasons, and I'm also thankful that here in Northwest Alabama, we get just enough of each one that for me, and this may not be for you, and if it's not, that's fine, but for me, we get just enough of each season that I'm always ready for the next one, right? We're into spring now. We came out of winter. We had the ice thing, and so a little bit of winter time and a slowdown, and so then we're ready for spring, and that rolls into summer, and then that rolls into football season, fall, and so you get it. I mean, I like the fact that I'm just always ready for what's next. And it's a blessing when you think about it, when you go outside and look around and you're enjoying the great outdoors. One of the reminders that ought to always be there for us is that God made a decision to reveal himself to the people he created. God has revealed himself. He's done that through what we call general revelation. And Malachi just read some words out of Psalm 19, and I'm not going to reread those right now, but I'll also add to that Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, further talking about this idea of the way God has revealed himself. It says there, they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. And then this is what verse 20 says, for ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. And so God has revealed himself through what he has created. But then further, God has revealed himself through what we call special revelation. And this is even more important than looking at the creation, because God has told us some things about himself. He's told us some things about what he expects. His special revelation. Hebrews chapter 1, 1 and 2. Long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets, and now in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. And so God made his will known. Jude 1 verse 3, dear friends, I've been eagerly planning to write to you about the salvation we all share, but now I find I must write about something else, urging you to defend the faith that God has entrusted once for all time to his holy people. So the body of faith, the body of doctrine, what we've learned about how to be saved, what we've learned about how to live life, the body of faith has been revealed by God to his holy people. And so, since God has revealed himself, everybody's listening, right? And you know the answer. You know, there are a lot of people that could be in a worship service today, and they're not. They're off doing other things. They're thinking about other things. And you think about, you know, when the question at the top of your lesson notes, who needs God? We know the answer. Everyone does. But what we're going to start into today, and we'll be in and out of this over the course of time, it's a series that explores the question, who needs God? And every single person is the answer. But we also need to talk about, okay, if everybody needs God and God has revealed himself, why are so many people not choosing to listen? Why are so many people ignoring God? Because in a world where it seems like less than ever before people are not listening to God, we need to understand both what is happening around us and what that means to us as it relates to fulfilling our purpose as Christians. And so I want to do a little bit of background here and set this up. This is not the normal kind of sermon. A lot of information today. If you missed some stuff, you can go back and listen later. But about 6 years ago, Andy Stanley did a series entitled, Who Needs God? And in the adult class that meets in the fellowship hall, about that same time, Butch taught some lessons on that series. And Butch and I were talking, and his class back there, it's not the same group of people today that it was back then. And so in the class that continues the discussion of the sermon that meets in the fellowship hall, he's going to be taking you back through some of that material over the weeks when he teaches. And so much of what we're going to consider in the next few minutes today comes from a book that was published in 2016. It's chapter 1 of Meet Generation Z, Understanding and Reaching the New Christian world. And that's really what we're diving into today is it's important for all of us to understand what it means to be living now in a post-Christian world. And so here's some more background. Back in 98, historian Christopher Dawson made the case that there have been 6 identifiable ages in the history of Christianity. So if you go all the way back to the day of Pentecost and you come forward just under 2,000 years, 6 identifiable ages. And he said in each one of the ages there's a commonality. Each one begins and ends with a crisis going on among Christians. He states the heart of each crisis was the same: intense attack by new enemies from within and outside the church, which in turn demanded new spiritual determination and drive. And so James Emery White, who's written this book, he believes, and others hold to him with this idea, that we are now entering a 7th age as it relates to Christianity. And so his take is that the most profound issue related to this 2nd age is a second fall that has now resulted in us being part of a culture that is post-Christian. And so I want to walk through some aspects, some characteristics, some identifying marks, you might say, of this 7th age. What does it look like? And now, one editorial comment as we start, we live in the Bible Belt. Arguably, we live in the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. And so as we talk about these things, it might cloud our vision a little bit related to what's going on in the broader world around us, because we're going to talk about some things that may not sound like Russellville, Alabama, may not sound like the Shoals. It may just not sound a whole lot like our area, but stick with me. And so the first identifying mark, he said, from within the Christian movement, one of the things that's going to happen in this 7th age is the southward expansion, explosive growth even of Christianity southward into Africa, Asia, Latin America. And that's going to be a factor. And what are the impacts going to be on that for us? Well, he quotes another author, Philip Jenkins, who holds that by 2050, only 1 Christian out of 5 will be a non-Latino white person, and the center of gravity for the Christian world will have shifted firmly to the southern hemisphere. You maybe can recall sitting in a worship service at one point and the preacher's trying to motivate us toward being more active and being more evangelistic and fulfilling our purpose. And the preacher may have done some of this doom and gloom and said, hey, there will be a day when other countries have to start sending missionaries here to the United States because the United States will no longer be the place that sends missionaries to the rest of the world. You may have heard one of those things. Well, if these numbers come to pass the way these future lookers are saying, that day will come. That day will come. The second key is the significant challenge, the rise of Islam, and whether it is going to modernize peacefully or violently. And yes, I'm making that point on a weekend where just this past week we saw the violent side of what happens with that false religion. Number 3, the third critical factor related to the 7th age is what White refers to is the radical redefinition of the most foundational institutions within creation itself, marriage and the family. It's not news to any of us that our culture has radically redefined the idea of family. In a lot of cases, folks they're in family situations that in no way resemble the blueprint that God has given us in His Word. White's statement is this: male with male, female with female, children with surrogates, multiple parents, polygamy, polyamorous unions abound. And then he says it's a new day in which the very idea of family is being recast in light of personal desire. Why are we having a marriage seminar next month? Why is our summer series this summer going to be devoted to strengthening the family? It's because there is a great deal of pressure from culture around us to redefine family in ways that God didn't design it to be. And so, number 4, even beyond the family, White holds that there's a challenge being brought to us regarding the very idea of what it means to be human. And he explains that as he's taught, he's long told his graduate theology students that the doctrine of humanity is by far the most pressing doctrine of our day in regard to culture. And what he means by that, he says it's the one area of Christian thought that is most challenged by the world in which we live, not to mention the one that we have the least to draw from historically. In other words, on the things he's talking about, you're not going to find anything from what we would call the church fathers. You're not going to find somebody like Luther weighing in on stem cell research or human cloning or transsexualism, because all these things have developed since these guys lived. And so there's this heavy lifting that must be done, this challenge that must be undertaken. So as new technology occurs, we look at the technology, and then we have to try to go to Scripture to see if there's any biblical principle that might uphold or stand in the way of what it is somebody's wanting to do. Because we all understand that just because we can do a certain thing doesn't always mean we should do a certain thing, or that it's even right to do a certain thing. And so he's saying the doctrine of humanity is a big deal. And then finally, number 5, he says, and we've mentioned this already, he says the most profound issue is what he refers to as the second fall. He says the most profound cultural challenges, he said it encompasses all the trends we've talked about and more. And you remember the first fall, that led to humans, that led to Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. When sin arrived, harmony with God was fractured, paradise was lost. The Bible is God's story of love in Him providing us and explaining to us that there is a way back. There's a way to be back in harmony with Him, back in relationship with Him again. So what is the second fall? Well, here's how White describes it. He says, in our world, increasing numbers of people lead their lives without any sense of needing to look to a higher power, to something outside themselves. He continues, leaders of science and commerce, education and politics, regardless of their personal views, do not tend to operate with any reference to a transcendent truth, much less to God. Now, he acknowledges, if we're reading his words here in the U.S., our inclination might be to push back a little bit. He acknowledges that most people believe in God, but then he says this, he says, but something like atheism isn't at the heart of the second fall, because philosophical atheism is not at the heart of secularism, nor the principal challenges to Christian faith. Then he says, the heart of secularism is a functional atheism. Rather than rejecting the idea of God, our culture simply ignores Him. One of the reasons we talked about functional atheism a few weeks ago, and if you missed that, I would challenge you to go back and give that your attention, because in a world where we're representing Christ, we must never look like we're living with no mind for godly things. People need to see who we're living for. Researcher Kathy Lynn Grossman, she's quoted by White. She worked on a study in 2008 that documented the rise of the nuns, and we're going to talk more about that. But she said people today aren't merely secularized. They're not thinking about religion and rejecting it. They're not thinking about it at all. And this research-based fact is a huge issue because it is a huge break in the history of Western thought and culture, and even in terms of what we find in Scripture. You remember Acts chapter 17, Paul shows up on Mars Hill, and he's troubled because he's walking through there, and there are all these idols. And there's even this one idol to the just in case we left one out, God, we want to worship you too. And so he begins to try to explain to them the unknown God and to help them understand he is the only real God. The people of Paul's day may not have always come to know the God of heaven. But there was never a sense among people that they themselves were supreme. Everybody understood that we had to come from somewhere. There has to be something bigger and better and more important than just us. And here in our culture, people seem to have forgotten that. And so all that to say, we now live in a culture that is referred to as post-Christian. Fewer people than ever before are thinking about God, and it also explains the rise of the nuns. And so what are the nuns? And this isn't who beats on your hand in certain kinds of schools, not that. This is N-O-N-E-S. These are described as the religiously unaffiliated, and their numbers are increasing. And so what do we mean by religiously unaffiliated? This is a person when there's a survey, there's a poll, when they're asked, they don't say things like, well, I attend the Church of Christ, or I'm Baptist, or I'm Methodist, or I'm Catholic, or I'm whatever. They don't say things like that. They will say, I am nothing. Numbers again increasing, faster growing than any other group. In the 30s and 40s, this numbered about 5% of our population. By 1990, that number had risen to just over 8%. By 2008, the number was 15%. By 2012, the number was nudging 20%. And by 2014, 19 to 23% is what was being reported. Being a nun trends higher among white people, and the percentage of people who describe themselves as nuns increases as income levels increase. In other words, the more I have, the less I need to think about God. Today, the number appears to be holding steady around that 19 to 23%. So 1 out of every 4 to 5 people, 1 out of every 3 people for those who are under 30. White reports nuns now be the largest religious group in the U.S., and of course that creates a bit of a mental train wreck. They're nuns, but they're a religious group. How does that work? But remember, it's not that all of them are saying they don't believe God exists. It's that they're simply not thinking about Him. Further, many of them would no longer see themselves as professing Christians. As of 2016, only 71% of American adults would call themselves Christian, down from nearly 80%. That number had decreased to just 63% as of 2021. And so while 85% of American adults were raised Christian, nearly a quarter of them no longer identify with Christianity. And according to White, this fall is widespread, crossing race, gender, educational, and geographic barriers. Another dynamic is that with each passing year, these self-described nuns, they're growing more and more secular. What does that mean? The number of nuns who continue to believe in God or pray to God has been in an ongoing decline. 62% never pray. 33% of them now do not believe in God, whereas in 2007, 57% of all nuns felt religion was of little importance to their lives. By 2014, that number had climbed to 67% of all respondents. White also reports that the numbers are growing worse among younger respondents than among older ones, and in other words, the younger the generation, the more post-Christian it is. Where have the nuns gone? The answer is nowhere. It's not brand switching religiously, it's an abandonment of a defined religion altogether. Now again, you may be pushing back on this a little bit. You may be saying, well, that's not what I encounter as I go about my day-to-day life here in Northwest Alabama. And there's a reason for that. People do seem to be more religious in our area than maybe I've just described. And there's a bit of good news there. Alabama, the rate of those who would describe themselves as nuns is about half the national average. But before we celebrate that too much, there still are some factors to consider. Are your kids always going to live in Franklin County or the Shoals? And even if they stay here within Alabama, it's like everywhere else. The larger cities are going to hold more folks who aren't thinking about God than maybe rural cities will. What about if your children move away out of state? Where are they going to move to? And what if something happens where some of us choose to move to different places? And then what about the influx of people who are moving here in increasingly larger numbers from places in the country that are much less religious? What kind of impact is that going to have on our area? See, there's plenty to be thinking about, and that's where we want to finish up today for just a few minutes. I want to think about 4 observations, 4 key learnings that ought to be on our minds in light of all that we've just talked about. Number 1, the Lord's church has fallen way short in fulfilling its mission. The Great Commission, Jesus charged to us to be constantly making disciples. It continues to need increased attention from every single one of us who claim we follow Jesus, because that's who his command was given to. Our country was founded with the idea of freedom of religion as one of its pillars, but for many today in our country, it's been redefined as freedom from religion. That ought to have our attention, because you will not pass a person on the street who doesn't have the same appointment with God that you do. We're all going to line up together at the same point in time to bow the knee before Jesus. We're all on our way to that same place, that same appointment. Number 2, opportunities abound for sharing the good news of salvation. Our constant prayer should be that individually and as a church family, our eyes be open and our hearts be soft to the spiritual need that so many around us have. We must be praying for the courage to speak up, the courage to take action, the courage to be the arms, the hands, the legs, the feet of the Lord's body, because that's what he's declared us to be. He's left us here to help get his work done. Number 3, to be successful, it is more important than ever in a post-Christian world for Jesus followers to avoid looking like the world. White says there are 3 things we need to be guarding against, 3 things: the effects of secularization, privatization, and pluralization. Very quickly, these 3. Secularization has been defined as the process by which sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and its symbols. What does that look like? That looks like taking the 10 Commandments out of the courthouse because of the gross misunderstanding and redefinition of what separation of church and state was intended to be. In other words, the church is losing influence as a shaper of life and thought in the wider social order, and Christianity is losing its place as the dominant worldview. So as individuals, we got to avoid falling into the trap that many in society around us fall into. Number 2, privatization. The chasm between the public and private sectors of life. Religious things are increasingly being placed by folks in the private sector. Another way of saying it, when it comes to things such as business, politics, even marriage and the home, personal faith is bracketed off. So faith becomes this compartment. You think about those plates we eat on back in the fellowship hall. Faith becomes like one compartment on that plate, and so we can segregate that away from everything else we do in life, rather than understanding that our faith is actually the plate that undergirds, that holds everything that we do. So we've got to guard against that one. And then finally, pluralization. That is the process by which individuals are confronted with the staggering number of ideologies, I'm trying to go quick, and faith options that compete for our attention today. Jesus said he's the one way. That's John 14, verse 6. Most simple message we can share with people is there's only one way, and Jesus says he's it. Only way out of here. But think about it this way. Religion, at least in terms of the idea of there being one God, who must be considered as as life is lived, one who is, blankets every thought, society, culture, everything, everything must come back to God. Today, that canopy, that God canopy is gone. And instead, you've got all these little bitty tents all over the world, and people are choosing to get under all these little different places, all these little different tents. And the misunderstanding of what tolerance is all about supports the false notion that one tent is just as good as the next. In other words, it's not appropriate in today's world to tell someone that they're not under the Jesus tent and that the Jesus tent is the only one that's going to get them out of here. But we got to tell people that. And so then finally, fulfilling our mission will be more challenging since the squishy center, and I hate that term. Any of y'all remember freshen up gum? Back in the 80s, you'd open up the gum and you'd chew into it and the juice was inside, the cinnamon or whatever. That's what, when I hear squishy center, that's what I think of freshen up gum. But fulfilling our mission will be more challenging because the squishy center no longer trends in our direction. And he explains the idea this way. If you've got a scale and you've got two extremes to the scale, on this side you've got hardcore secular people. I don't believe in God. I don't care about God. He says you put 25% of folks over here. And he says on the other side, you put 25% of folks who are, in their eyes at least, legitimate Jesus followers. Jesus is who I try to live for. Jesus is running my life. Every decision made in light of Jesus. And he said if you put those two extremes off to the side, in the middle, he says you got about 50% of our country. And he refers to it as the squishy center because he says those in the middle tend to be soft and pliable in terms of being shaped and formed. He says their individual beliefs have little definition and even less conviction. And if they consider themselves Christian, it's with a small c. And they tend to move toward, and here's the key, they tend to move toward whatever is culturally most influencing. And he said in the past, the forces within culture tended to move people in the direction of believers, in the direction of Christianity. In the past, people would have called themselves Christian because it was the cultural thing to do. And in the past, they probably would have gone to church, at least on special days, because there was a certain cultural pressure to show up at church once in a while. I remember years ago, couldn't tell you his name, so don't ask me, because I legitimately have no idea. But we hadn't been here long, but a physician moved into Russellville. And he was visiting every church in town, glad-handing his way through every church. He wanted to show himself to be religious. That may be great for building a medical practice. I don't know if he's still in town now or not. I really don't know. But there was a cultural pressure at one point toward God. But he said today, people in the center say they are nothing because that's the cultural thing to say. And they don't go to church either because that's the cultural thing not to do. And it's a big deal because when you think about our mission field and you think about our marching orders and what we've been left here to do, that squishy center tends to be the heart of the mission field. And the field is now going to be a more difficult row to hoe since people are trending in the direction of the secular. And so as we sow seed, finding receptive soil is going to be more challenging than it was before. It'll be more challenging to build a relational bridge because there's less cultural pressure for people to trend toward the church. And to the degree that there is still some social pressure in favor of Jesus here in our part of the country, we need to maximize that. We need to take advantage of that. So who needs Jesus? Every person does. How many of them will we reach? And will we be the kinds of disciples who do a good job of representing the Savior we promote? I mean, those are great questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And the news isn't all bad, and you know that. The victory Jesus claimed when he left that empty tomb, that can't be compromised. That cannot be taken away. Further, Christianity is on the rise worldwide. Christianity remains the largest faith in the world, and projections out to 2050 see it continuing to maintain that lead. I leave you this morning with this inspired picture of the God that so many people today are ignoring. and ignoring to their own detriment. This is the God that we live for, and this is the God we share. Back to Psalm 19, verse 7. The instructions of the Lord are perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The commandments of the Lord are right, bringing joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are clear, giving insight for living. Reverence for the Lord is pure, lasting forever. The laws of the Lord are true, each one is fair. They're more desirable than gold, even the finest gold. They're sweeter than honey, even honey dripping from the comb. They're a warning to your servant, a great reward for those who obey them. How can I know all the sins lurking in my heart? Cleanse me from these hidden faults. Keep your servant from the deliberate sins. Don't let them control me. Then I'll be free of guilt and innocent of great sin. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O God, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. This week, who can we help find God? Who can we help know the God who has revealed himself? And in the meantime, are the words of your mouth and my mouth and the meditation of your heart and my heart, are they pleasing to God? If there's something that's standing in the way of your relationship with God today, maybe it's being immersed for the remission of your sins, let us help you with that. Or maybe it's one of those where the world has gotten a hold of you and removed your focus and you've not thought about God like you should. Maybe that's a private conversation with God. Maybe it's a public confession where we pray with you and for you. If you have a need, let it be known while Chase leads us in the song he's selected.